This week's episode is brought to you by Ecolab. Looking to lower production costs without compromising quality? Purolite purification resins from Ecolab Life Sciences offer unmatched performance with uniquely uniform beads for consistent results every time. Plus, with dual contingent supply, you get supply chain security you can count on. Discover the power of Purolite resins at puroliteresins.com/ecolab. That's PUROLITERESINS.com/ECOLAB. Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today we're speaking with Barry Quart, CEO at Connect Biopharma, originally a Chinese biotech that has now moved to San Diego. I'm excited to speak with Barry about Connect Bio, which is developing an intriguing product candidate, an antibody targeting acute asthma and COPD exacerbations, and to learn about the challenges and benefits of moving Connect Bio to California. We'll also delve into Barry's past experiences as a leader of regulatory affairs at BMS and Pfizer and get his take on the inner workings of the FDA, past and present. Barry is a biotech founder and CEO as well. He co-founded and led Ardia Biosciences and invented a drug for gout before selling the company to AstraZeneca for over $1 billion. All told, Barry has overseen the FDA approval of 9 drugs to date and hopes to make it to 10 at Connect Biopharma. Barry, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for that great introduction.
What led you into the biopharmaceutical industry initially? I think you started out as regulatory affairs manager at BMS.
Yeah, actually, when I started, it was still just Bristol Myers. So I hate to date myself. And it was in clinical research. So I've had the opportunity across my career to be involved in many aspects of the drug discovery development area. Went into regulatory affairs and really was a tremendous experience in terms of understanding really the nuts and bolts of drug development and how to maneuver products through the FDA. Although I will say the FDA of the early 80s and 90s is definitely different than the FDA that we have today. On both on the good side and the bad side. It took forever to get drugs through the FDA process in the 70s and 80s before PDUFA, where they had a time limit on how long they could take. It would literally take them over a year to open the boxes before they started even reviewing the application. So it's been a very interesting, process to see how the FDA has evolved over those years. And I think one of the things that's unfortunate in the current era is that the pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, don't have the opportunity of relatively frequent interaction with the actual reviewers. In my early days, you could pick up the phone and call the reviewer and ask them a question so that when you're designing a study or you have an issue, you had relatively quick response and could make sure that you're doing things that will ultimately be successful for the product. Now everything has to go through their bureaucracy. You have to go through a project manager. You're lucky if you get a response. You're constantly pinging them, trying to get a response. So, while there's a time limit on how long they can take, the whole process has really been changed in what I would say not necessarily a positive fashion. And now, obviously, we're going through an even more dramatic change where, all I can do is hope that ultimately we get to a better place. But it's hard to tell right now.
Yeah, I want to get back into the FDA in just a minute, but I'm really curious to ask you about, your departure from big pharma and into biotech. You've worked at several companies. I won't name all of them, but one thing that stuck out to me on your resume, Barry, was your co-founding and leading Ardia, and your invention of a gout drug, Zurampic. Is there a story to tell there about how that
Uh,
happened?
yeah, there's a story to tell. So take a step back. Was at a biotech. My first biotech foray in San Diego was a company called Agron Pharmaceuticals, which was just drug discovery at the time I joined. We fortunately had a very interesting HIV protease inhibitor that had been designed by the chemists and the X-ray crystallographers, and decided to develop it ourselves. And we took it from the lab bench to a U.S. approval in the late 90s in just over 3 years. Because we actually had remarkable collaboration with the FDA, who was working hard to get drugs out to HIV patients. And that was a tremendously successful, rewarding period of time. Unfortunately, what happens is that then that company got swallowed up by Warren Lambert. That Warren Lambert got swallowed up by a bigger fish, Pfizer. Stayed on to run the La Jolla Laboratories for Pfizer, which basically was my old labs at Agron. And then it's hard to go from a small biotech or even a mid-sized biotech back to large pharma. They're just so slow and so many processes. So I essentially kind of retired and took a break from pharma, and then had the opportunity to take over a public shell with my co-founder and bring some technology into it. And the goal of that, what became Ardea, was to bring in some HIV assets, kind of
Oh,
continue
interesting.
on from what I had been doing at Agron and bring in some products specifically focused on resistance. This was a period of time where HIV resistance was a significant issue. And so we had the opportunity of in licensing some NNRTIs for resistant virus. Um, the only issue is that the data that was provided us at the time that we brought it in, yeah, it looked like it should be a once a day or maybe even longer half-life. And that's the first drugs approved for HIV, we pushed them through as quickly as we could because you had 50,000 people dying a year at that point. And the fact that it might be 3 times a day, that's okay, as long as it actually, had a significant benefit to the patient. But once those drugs were out and successfully getting patients, changing a fatal disease into a chronic disease, now patients wanted something that was less frequent, easier to take, less side effects. And so that's kind of where the focus was. And we were looking for something that was definitely once a day. Put it into a phase 1 study, healthy volunteers, and unfortunately, it was going to be another at least twice a day product. And so it was disappointing. And to be honest, at that point, it was a question of, do we just pack up and, close shop? Because, our primary opportunity certainly didn't look like it was very exciting. But as I was going through the data in this healthy volunteer study, I noted that every person who got the drug saw a dramatic decrease in uric acid levels. And uric acid is the underlying cause of gout. So that led me to think, well, man, maybe there's clearly some pharmacology going on here. Ultimately figured out it was a metabolite of the HIV drug that was producing this effect of lowering uric acid. And we turned that metabolite into Zurampic. And it was a period of time where it was great, I think, because it shed light on a pretty much forgotten disease. There hadn't been really a lot of attention on gout, even though it affects millions of patients. It's just one of those diseases where I think clinicians felt like, well, this is a self-inflicted disease. I'm going to spend my time, trying to help patients with, other kinds of problems, even though a lot of them were self-inflicted at the end of the day. But with gout, it was always felt like, if you just followed the right diet, you wouldn't have a problem. But so it was a great opportunity to develop something to help a very large population of patients.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a big pivot. You said you noticed this benefit in a study of healthy volunteers who I guess, had said as part of intake, that they had gout, and this was just something that kind of popped out, or that investigators were raising their hands and saying, yeah, we're noticing that it's having this effect.
Actually, no, these were healthy volunteers, so they didn't have gout,
Oh,
but
okay.
so every person has uric acid. Yeah, uric acid is just a byproduct of a breakdown in the body. And normally in people who, have normal levels of uric acid, it gets excreted through the urine. And it's never a problem. And in people who have gout, their levels go up too high. And so once you get to a certain concentration in the blood, it starts to crystallize out in joints and
Right.
basically is a white powder that is now floating around in the joint space. And at certain periods of time during the year, that produces a very dramatic inflammatory response in that joint. Tends to be the big toe. Interesting. It's kind of colder environment, less solubility of the uric acid sitting out there at the end of the foot. And it can be very startling to people because it's intensely painful.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't remember stubbing my toe, but it hurts like hell.
Yeah.
And that's the first time usually they get diagnosed with gout because not that many people even monitor uric acid. It's, it's just a marker that ultimately, if you have gout, you're going to concentrate on, but otherwise, people pretty much ignore it. And so, since everyone has it, it was an opportunity to see a change even in the healthy volunteers because it was a profound change. This wasn't, just a modest decline. It went down over 50% from their baseline, and
Wow.
that's something that's noticeable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you recognize you discovered this effect. You pivoted to developing this gout drug. What did you have to do operations wise? Did you have to hire, new people that were experts in this therapeutic area? Did you have to change kind of, your manufacturing strategy? What did you have to do?
Well, at this stage of the organization, it was still pretty early, and we had, a pretty small group. So definitely from that point on, any hiring we did was people who had more inflammatory, more rheumatology experience. So
Yeah.
gout's generally treated by rheumatologists or internists. And so, yeah, definitely kind of closed down the virology group and built up the inflammation side of the organization. But it was, this was a pretty small group at the time, so it wasn't a huge overall. It was really more of changing focus, moving
Got it.
forward. But yeah, definitely a significant pivot. We went from an HIV focused company to a gout focused company. And that was, the challenging part of that was telling the story to the investment community because, they made a decision to invest in the company based on, HIV, and the AIDS market at the time clearly was very robust. And now I have to go out and explain, well, that was a great idea, but we have an even better idea now. Here's a completely untapped opportunity, and with millions and millions of patients. And we were successful in raising the money to develop the product ultimately, to registration. As you noted, we actually sold our data to AstraZeneca while it was still in phase three. So they took the bet that the phase three studies would be successful, and wanted to get involved early, before launch planning, and so they could get a significant head start in making sure it had a successful launch. That in and of itself was interesting because very shortly after they made that decision, they changed CEOs, who then he changed the focus of the company too, and decided, yeah, primary care not that exciting anymore. We want to be in oncology. We want to be in immuno-oncology. And so that whole company pivoted, and we were kind of left with, we're not sure who's going to sell this product.
And then after you left that company, you went to Heron Therapeutics as CEO, and oversaw the approval of 4 drugs there, I believe. I think they were mostly antiemetics. Is that right? Maybe an anesthetic as well?
Yeah, so I moved out of again, as once we got taken over by a large pharma, not quite as interesting to run the company. We were a wholly owned subsidiary, so I continued to run Ardea for a year, but definitely was not nearly as rewarding as running an independent company. So moved to what was a small a company called AP Pharma that had had several failures in getting their one drug approved, which was a long-acting antiemetic for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and decided to see if I could help them. Took over the company, ended up kind of rebranding it to Heron Therapeutics, and ultimately got that product approved. A second one in the same area of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And then the first drug, the what was called Sustol, was based on their in-house polymer technology. So AP Pharma was a polymer technology company that saw the pharma companies around it in South San Francisco and Redwood City getting swallowed up for large amounts of money, and felt like, we'd rather be in that business than making polymers. So can we take one of our polymers and turn it into a drug delivery device? And one of their polymers was quite good at releasing drug over an extended period. So that first drug, Sustol, they took a short-acting, very effective agent and turned it into a much longer-acting agent for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And that was valuable because that nausea and vomiting can last, up to 5 days. And in fact, there's an initial period, and then there's a delayed period. And so if you just take something that's going to work for a day, you can have severe nausea and vomiting, day 3, day 4. So it's important to have that extended release of the drug. As I said, we ultimately got that approved, which was challenging because it was a new polymer, complicated to make, and we had to go through a lot of hurdles with the FDA. But once we were getting it approved, my view was, what else can we do with it? We've already had to set up manufacturing. We've got the FDA to approve it. The next drug that we put into it's not going to take anywhere near as long, hopefully. And so, what else can we do with it? And we thought, why don't we put a local anesthetic and use it for post-operative pain, where you could put this polymer into the incision, And it would be like using Novocaine, with a dental procedure, block the pain at the site of where it's being generated, but do that over an extended period. And most severe pain with a surgical procedure usually lasts around 3 days. And if you can get people past that 3 day period, then their pain usually can get controlled by, Tylenol, Advil. You don't have to take narcotics. And so that was really the goal. Can we extend the benefit of a very, commonly used local anesthetic, bupivacaine, make it last long enough to get the patient past where they need to take opiates? Big issue with opiates at that period was really becoming to the forefront as, more people dying than, back in the AIDS epidemic period. And so that seemed like a great opportunity to benefit patients. If you don't take an opiate, you can't get addicted to it. And so
Right.
let's see if we can avoid the need for opiates, after surgery. And so we took that through the development process. Very challenging, and I will say very disappointing in terms of the FDA's participation, let's say, in that development process. As I mentioned, with HIV drugs, they were very open to collaborating and giving input on a very frequent basis, making sure that we delivered to them, drugs that could get approved and get approved quickly. In those days, the first few HIV protease inhibitors, which were the cornerstone of the AIDS cocktail, um, they went through the review process in just a matter of a few months, because there was so much pressure on the FDA to get these drugs out. So I went to them and said, "Hey, why don't we work together again?" That was highly successful. These drugs obviously saved millions of lives. Opiates are killing more people than HIV at that, in the worst period of the AIDS epidemic. Let's collaborate and get a drug out there so patients don't have to take opiates. Um, and their response at that time was, not interested, uh,
Interesting.
which was unfortunate because I think we couldn't have gotten our drug out to patients sooner, and that would have been very beneficial for patients. It would have also been more beneficial for shareholders because, unfortunately, with the delays at the FDA and manufacturing difficulties, we ended up launching that product right during COVID, and launching a hospital product when hospitals are basically closed down to elective surgeries, or just opening up, but you can't get your reps in because of HIV prohibitions. It was problematic, and the product never really got the best shot at being successful because of the timing of launch was just terrible.
And you credit that, the kind of unwilling, and granted, COVID was going on, and I assume a lot of the agency was very focused on COVID, treatments, but there wasn't the same amount of clamoring patient groups, others, media, really pushing for, a non-opioid analgesic at that point, and as a result, maybe the FDA wasn't acting as quickly on it.
And there's no question. And this was actually pre-COVID that
Oh,
these,
okay.
because the development process went on for
Right. Okay.
quite,
Yeah.
quite a
Yeah.
few
Yeah.
years. And yeah, I went to talk to them well before COVID. And it wasn't just us. You can find pictures on the internet of people who had lost children or relatives to opiates, bringing a giant heroin spoon to the FDA and protesting the fact the agency was doing so little to really deal with the opiate issue, except approving opiates faster
Yeah.
than they were approving drugs to avoid opiates.
Yeah, that's a good point because it's not like no one was talking about the opioid crisis at that point in time. Maybe it hadn't reached its absolute height yet, but it was going in that direction.
No question, no
Yeah.
question. And I think obviously there's, different internal politics at the agency, and I'm sure it's not that the individuals that work there didn't care,
Yeah.
but there was very much a movement away from collaborating with industry. Unfortunately, I think we're going to go even further with the current administration trying to completely disassociate the FDA from any potential entanglements with pharma. And, rather than it being a somewhat collaborative effort, where they're obviously the regulator and we're obviously, working to develop drugs, it's still in the best interest of patients for us to communicate in a collaborative fashion so that they can tell us, hey, we need you to do X, Y, Z. And if you don't do that, then the likelihood of you getting this product approved goes down. You don't have to
Right.
follow our instructions or guidance, but that's obviously in the best interest of moving the product along. But if you don't have that kind of back and forth communication, then we're just trying to do the best we can, and guess as to what they're ultimately going to accept.
Which doesn't benefit anyone
No,
ultimately, patients, businesses, or agency.
exactly. It's a lot of money that you spend answering questions already. And answering questions that you don't need to is, an additional waste of a lot of resource.
I want to come back to the FDA a little bit further into our conversation, but let's talk about Connect Biopharma a little bit first. Barry, what convinced you to join Connect Biopharma as CEO? And what was your diligence process like? What kinds of questions did you ask before taking the CEO role?
This was an interesting project because I wasn't really looking for necessarily going back into running a public biotech at the time. The company approached me. They were looking to change the management, bring people in with more development experience, more experience working with the investment community. And, would I take a look? And I spent 3 months going through their data, under CDA and basically kind of reanalyzed their primary trial, looking at the raw data. And I at the end of that felt like this was an incredibly undervalued asset that worked much better than people perceived, and had a unique opportunity to fill a void that really hadn't been focused on. And I love those kinds of opportunities where you can truly change how patients are treated, and produce some very significant clinical benefit across a large population of patients. And in this case, there's a number of biologics that have been developed for asthma, and many that are in development for COPD. And all of those drugs are solely focused on trying to reduce the number of asthma attacks. We call them exacerbations, but basically where a patient can be stable over a period of time and then all of a sudden has a hard time breathing. And they go to the medicine cabinet, they get their inhaler, they use their inhaler, and it's not helping. And you get to the point where, when you can't breathe well, that produces a lot of anxiety.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
you know, and you can die from an asthma attack. So what happens is you have over 1 million people a year that go to the emergency room for an asthma attack. If they're treated the same way that they were treated 20 years ago, they get a a dose of steroid and they get more bronchodilator, trying to overwhelm the system until they get the relaxation in the lungs and you know the muscles in the lungs relax, get air into the lungs. Most of those people get treated at the ER and sent home. And what we found is you have all these biologics that are being used, but none of them had ever really been focused on that acute episode. Biologics, people tend to think they take days, weeks, maybe months to work.
Right.
You're trying to target the immune system, inflammatory processes, and that can take a while. And so, nobody really targeted the acute use of a biologic. But what I found in the data that Connect had generated was one of the things they did really well was to start looking early when they started treating these chronic patients. And it showed that the drug worked rapidly. In fact, as I delved into their data, I found that the majority of the benefit was derived the next morning after a dose. So less than 24 hours, you saw multiple hundreds of mil improvement in airway function, or FEV1 as we call it, and which is a very dramatic improvement in airway function very, very quickly. And that led us to say, this is a unique opportunity, a complete white space. Nobody's evaluating biologics in this area. No biologics are approved. And in fact, all of the biologics that are approved for asthma say explicitly don't use to treat an exacerbation. So it's like, okay, I've got the drug that looks like it can work immediately with dramatic improvements in what you're trying to do for an asthma patient having an exacerbation. And let's see if we can't develop this for that population. We now just in this last week announced that we've initiated 2 phase 2 trials, one in asthma patients, one in COPD patients, looking at the use of the drug in an acute setting of people having an exacerbation. A goal of showing, improved airway function, hopefully showing fewer people that get the drug in the ER get hospitalized. If they get hospitalized, hopefully we can show they stay there less days. And then just as important, we've also found that people who have had an exacerbation have a pretty high risk of having another one in the following weeks. And that's a key issue from a health economic point of view, because if there's anything I learned from trying to sell drugs in the hospital is that it's not always how much you're benefiting the patient. It's you have to show the hospital why it benefits them, because they're the ones paying for that drug. It gets covered under their single bundled payment. And if you can't show them why there's value to the hospital, it almost doesn't matter that you're benefiting the patient. So showing a health economic improvement is really critical. And we found that, quite interesting, that patient goes into the ER, they get treated, the hospital gets a single bundled payment for that visit. So it covers everything, covers the drugs they get, the doctor, etc. And that covers that patient for a month. So if the patient comes back in 2 weeks, 3 weeks with another exacerbation, hospital doesn't get paid again. So they actually have a vested interest beyond just good health care to not have that patient come back. And if you have almost 50% of patients having either a worsening of that index exacerbation or a second exacerbation during that 4-week period, you have a great opportunity of showing a health economic benefit that will help convince the hospital that, oh yeah, I'm gonna use this drug because it benefits me. Yeah, it's good for the patient, but it benefits us too. And that's really important.
Yeah, and this is rademikibart that we're talking about that has just entered two phase 2 trials. It's targeting acute asthma and COPD exacerbations, but it's not competing with something like albuterol, a rescue inhaler. But can they be used together? And you know, you alluded to the fact that those don't always work when someone's struggling to breathe. Can they be used together? But I guess clarify first that they're not competing with one another.
Correct. So, the definitely something I've learned over the years, the fastest, most expedient way to develop a drug and get it approved and get it used is to add it to standard of care, as long as that makes sense. And it's not trying to change standard of care. Medical practice doesn't change that fast.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty high hurdle to get it to change. So if you can show, hey, here's standard of care, here's adding our drug, a dramatic improvement for that patient, that's the best way to get drugs out to patients and get them used. So yeah, our approach is you have patients coming into the ER that they get the standard of care. They'll get that steroid, they'll get more inhaler, but we even know with that standard of care, half of them are going to get either worse as soon as they leave the ER, or have another episode within a few weeks. So our approach is these studies are blinded, randomized trials. Patients will get rademikibart or placebo on top of standard of care, and we'll be able to look at improvements in airway, how many people have a recurrence? Do we get them out, sooner? So we're benefiting the patient hopefully and the facility, and that will help ultimately justify approval and use of the product. But definitely the standard of care is the backdrop. No problem using it along with inhalers. And truthfully, we think there's a good rationale for the fact that it'll make the inhaler work better.
Right.
That there's some potential kind of synergy there. So, we hope to be able to show that as well. But just to also point out that the drug's already been in a chronic asthma study. 24-week study showed very good improvements in airway, very good reduction of exacerbations, the endpoint that you use for chronic studies. So the drug can clearly be used chronically. And it's not to say that we're not interested in that market, but our target right now is this complete white space where nobody has developed a drug to date, and that is for the acute exacerbation. Ultimately, down the road, I could easily foresee this drug being used acutely, and then patient does well, clinician keeps them on chronically.
I think it was an important point that you made that I just want to underscore about the time it takes to change the standard of care. I mean, particularly when you have a generically available inhaler, and it goes back to opioids as well. For pain, when you have a very cheap and effective drug as the standard of care, it makes it that much more difficult. Despite the kind of benefits profile of a new product sometimes.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, going back to the opiate issue, we demonstrated that our drug, which ultimately was launched and called Zinrelef, that product produces much greater pain reduction than opiates. You can take as much opiate as under the prescription guidelines of how much opiate you're allowed to take in a day. You can max out and you still won't get the same level of pain benefit as you got from our drug. But getting surgeons to use it was challenging because they're used to using opiates. It's like, well, I mean, patients do fine. I just give them a short course. Nobody
Yeah.
gets addicted, and everybody's fine. It's like, well, here's the data that shows, that we produce far better pain management. And if patients have better pain management, they can do more physical therapy. They, heal better. It's an uphill battle to change how people do their job and in that area, because the surgeon has been doing a particular surgery for 20 years. He thinks his patients are doing great. He's not about to say, "Oh yeah, I need to change what I'm doing," because obviously it's hasn't been that good for 20 years.
Yeah,
It's kind of a
right.
mindset that I'm everything I'm doing is just fine.
Yeah. Um, Going back to rademikibart, this drug I believe was discovered in China, where Connect Bio was located. It's now moved the headquarters to San Diego. What precipitated that move, and what kinds of challenges had to be overcome in bringing the company to California?
Yeah, it was. It's been an interesting process. It was one of the things that I discussed with the board, before joining, and it was, they had already come to the conclusion that it was time to make that transition. So this is a company that was started quite a few years ago in China, at a period of time when there was a lot of biotechs forming in China. There's great chemists there, great biologists, a highly educated population. So, certainly made sense at the time. A lot of companies, started labs there. But over the years, as what happens in, the U.S. biotech market, you kind of have peaks and troughs. And it's been a pretty difficult period of time, last several years in China to raise funds. And so there wasn't the kind of financial support and biotech is a business that you basically have to keep putting money into it
Yeah,
and until you get the drug out on the market, and then it takes money to launch the drug. So it's a capital intense business. China was clearly not the place to raise that kind of money any longer. So you have to go to the U.S. healthcare investors. And U.S. healthcare investors are pretty reluctant to invest in a Chinese company, to a large part because the information flow is not quite the same as it is with a U.S. based company. So in the case of Connect, it's traded on the Nasdaq, but the investors didn't have access to the normal kinds of information that a U.S. based company traded on the Nasdaq would be providing. So as at Heron, at Ardea, we put out what are called 10Ks and 10Qs. So every quarter, you put out your financial information, you put out an update on what's happening with your development activities, and it keeps the investment community up to date, and they feel like they can use that as a guide in terms of what's going on. As a foreign filer, you're not obligated to file any of those. You file a much more abbreviated report every 6 months. And so the information in that document is really dated because
yeah,
it was a quarter, behind already when it was filed, and now there's not another one coming out for 6 months. So as an investor, like this is pretty stale information, and I know I'm not going to get the normal updates. I'm just less inclined to think about investing in a company where there's not the usual data flow. And you're held to different accounting standards. The investment community was just not getting the kind of information that they're used to.
yeah,
So we made a decision that, we still have an office outside of Shanghai. They're doing great work in terms of Mostly it's on the chemistry manufacturing side of making rademikibart. They've identified a way to make it much less expensively. So we're optimizing that in our manufacturing lab. That'll get transferred to a U.S. manufacturer that we currently have that's making it the older process. So we have a lot, we still have activities going on in China, but we moved the headquarters to San Diego. There was basically, this was a Chinese biotech with a little outpost in San Diego. It's now, for all intents and purposes, a San Diego based biotech with a small outpost in China. And we've now put out our first 10K, put out our 10Q a week or so ago, and we will continue to put out normal filings that investors look for from here on out.
Was that a heavy lift to convert Connect Bio to a U.S. filer, to a GAAP reporting structure?
No question. This was not a trivial undertaking. We had to get a different accounting firm. That accounting firm had to basically go back and redo, previous audits so they could be familiar with what's going on in the company. So very heavy lift by the finance team. I'm very fortunate that we were able to bring in, most of the finance team from the last company, and that finance team had come from the previous company. So people that I've worked with for many years who are incredibly competent, and they made that heavy lift look easy, but I know how much work it took to get done. And and working very closely with the new auditing firm, we were able to get it done on time, and everything went very smoothly.
There's another interesting piece of rademikibart that I wanted to ask you about, Barry. In late 2023, Connect Bio outlicensed it to Simcere, a large Chinese-based or China-based company, for late-stage trials, registration, commercialization in China. Can you, I guess, explain the strategy behind that transaction? And really, I guess what I'm curious about is whether that helps with your approach to the FDA, engagement with the FDA, ultimately approval in the U.S.
Yeah. So this was a transaction that was finalized before I joined.
Okay.
But what I can certainly say is that Simcere are great partners. I've met with the company many times. We have a joint steering committee every quarter. They're taking a very active approach towards finishing up development in China. And we anticipate that they will file first in atopic dermatitis and then in asthma, a year or two after that. But they're working very hard to get the drug on the market as quickly as they can. Dupixent is doing extremely well. So one thing that probably should let people know, we have rademikibart is a second generation Dupixent going after the same target. And, our goal is, in clinical development to show the benefits of, why rademikibart versus Dupixent. And they're trying to do the same thing in China, where Dupixent has done a phenomenal job in its launch, and it hasn't been on the market there very long. So they're working very actively. Going back to the question of what's the benefit. Well, number one, in last year, the company received over 25 million in upfront and milestone payments. So, for a small biotech, significant, revenue coming in, non-dilutive financing is king in this business. You don't want to have to keep on selling shares and diluting current investors and employees. So the ability to get non-dilutive, dollars coming in of that magnitude is incredibly valuable. And then they're doing large trials in AD and asthma. Now, if we want to use that data, we will have to, provide a pretty strong rationale to the FDA as to why the patients in China are applicable to U.S. patients. You know, do they have the same drug levels? The difference, same safety profile. Is the information useful? Is the disease treated the same way? Now, it turns out in this case, there's remarkable similarities. Asthma is one of those diseases that has kind of international guidelines, the GINA guidelines, that everybody has adopted, and it's the Bible in terms of treating patients. So, the asthma data that will come out of China, we believe will be extremely useful in terms of ultimately getting rademikibart approved in the U.S. and hopefully will allow us to, maybe only do one phase 3 study here, which, is a significant cost benefit.
And that would, of course, require some engagement and some collaboration with the FDA. And I,
Yes.
I promise to bring the conversation back here. I want to just add, given your depth of experience in this area, Barry, working with the FDA over, hopefully, 10 approved products with Connect Bio. I wanted to ask you what some of the mistakes are that companies make, especially startups, early stage biotechs, with respect to FDA engagement.
Yeah, I think probably the one that comes to mind in that regard is that the agency generally doesn't give you, number one, really clear instructions. They provide guidance, so you have to ask a lot of questions when you go into a pre-IND or end of phase 2, whatever the meeting is. You got to make sure you ask every possible question you can think of, because it's your one opportunity to actually get written responses from them on a timely basis. And then when you, hopefully, if you have a follow up at, face-to-face meeting after their written responses, you gotta really drill into any outstanding questions. Um, and then most importantly, what will happen frequently is they'll say, we don't recommend you do that, but of course it's up to you, because they don't have really that many tools to make companies do what they want. They basically have the ability to say, yes, you're free to initiate your program. So, open your IND. So that's one period that they have kind of more control than usual. Or they can put you on clinical hold. It's not like they can just tell you, hey, we don't think you're ready, hold on. It's either, a clinical hold, which is, nobody wants to see that, or it's, hey, we can give you guidance, but you can take it or leave it. And so when they're giving companies guidance, a lot of times they tend to ignore it, or because they think that they might know better, and which is fine because the agency is not always 100% right, but you just have to listen carefully to what they're saying. And when they're telling you, we don't recommend this, you got to at least sit back and think about, well, what does that mean? And, what are they trying to tell us? Because they're not 100% transparent.
Yeah.
Uh, but what are they really trying to tell us? And I think that will help in most cases. Is the fact that they say, yeah, you're free to proceed, is not a seal of approval that they agree. It's
Right.
just that what you're doing is sufficiently safe. We can't stop you, but we're telling you we don't think that's the right approach.
Right. Right. We mentioned at the top that the FDA is going through something of a shakeup currently under the Trump administration. Are there any specific changes, Barry, that you would like to see implemented with respect to FDA's kind of standard operating procedures for drug review and approval?
Well, I think as I mentioned, over the years that I've worked with them and seen a lot of evolution, I think the one thing that was the most beneficial for patients and for, the companies, and truthfully the FDA too, was having an appropriate collaborative effort in terms of drug development. Our goal is to get drugs out to patients and produce the desired benefit for those patients. The FDA's goal, theoretically, is to get good drugs out to patients that provide a benefit to the patients. We pretty much have the same goal, kind of coming at it obviously very differently, and they are the regulator in a highly regulated industry. But I think that there's can be a great benefit to a more collaborative effort. Unfortunately, the general approach that's being taken in Washington today is a belief that there's been too much collaboration. There's been too much coziness between the FDA and industry, which I got to tell you, I certainly haven't seen. As I mentioned, it's been quite the opposite. But nonetheless, that seems to be the perception. And in today's world, perception is, 100% of reality. And so I'm afraid that we're going to end up with even more prohibitions on having that kind of collaborative effort, which is not going to serve anybody's benefit.
Yeah, certainly there have been some kind of pot shots taken on advisory committee meeting members. To your point, do you, in terms of improving collaboration, and let's hope that there's not a retrenchment and a widening gulf between the FDA and industry, but do you think that there is a new kind of formal meeting structure needed, or is it simply an issue of response time, and agency employees working within the structure that exists, but being more responsive more quickly? Which one would you like to see? New formal meetings or just better responsiveness?
Yeah, from my personal opinion, I think we had the meetings that are already set up under PDUFA are fine.
Okay.
You can utilize those and get the in terms of formal meetings, the information you need. I think that there needs to be, again, more ability to interact in between meetings. Um, and again, you can send them questions, you can send them letters saying, "Hey, we have the following issue. Can you provide assistance or input?" You may never get a response to that, or it could take months and months if they get around to it. So that's something where a more speedy responsiveness from the agency would certainly be beneficial. But going back to your comment on advisory committees, I guess it's all a matter of perception because people who don't understand this process always harp on, oh, this person on the committee got a waiver, but they were a consultant for 3 companies. Well, in this world, if you're an expert in asthma and really understand the use of drugs, how to the development process, what's best for the patient from a treatment point of view, we're going to go out and seek you.
Yeah, your expertise is in demand, right?
Right? I mean, because that's the information we need. And so we're going to go out and hire you as a consultant and say, "Hey, can you help us? Here's this new drug. First time there was an IL-4 antibody." I'm sure they went to the leading experts and said, "Hey, here's the biology. What do you think? Are we crazy or does this make sense?" And so those people would have signed up and got a small consulting fee. And, so then the FDA looking for advisory board meeting members, they should go after the leading experts in the world on asthma and development of drugs in asthma. And they'll take a look and say, okay, this person, did, a month of consulting for Pfizer. We can give them a waiver. It's not like they are beholden to Pfizer. Right? They're not going to vote
They're
yes.
not getting 20% of product sales.
Yeah, they're not going to vote yes just because they received a few hundred or a few $1,000s 2 years ago from Pfizer. So, yeah, they're independent. They work in an academic setting, no problem. That's the kind of people that you want on an ad board. Unfortunately, because there's this perception that, oh, those people are in the pocket of the industry, we can only take people who have never consulted for a pharmaceutical company. Chances are those probably aren't the best experts.
Right.
Because if they had been really good ones, somebody would have gone to search them out
Yeah.
and said, hey, what do you think? And then the other problem is that if they've never been involved in drug development, there's theory and then there's practice. And there's lots of people that have great ideas about how to develop a drug. But the problem is it's impossible to do that experiment. You can't find those patients. You can't get them enrolled. You can't do that study. And so there's got to be a certain amount of balance between what's the perfect way to answer a question and what's a practical way of answering a question, and one that also doesn't take 20 years and, $500 million. And so there's got to be a balance. And, the people that are on these committees need to at least have a sense of that balance. And it's always, over 30 years of going to advisory committee meetings, it's pretty easy to tell the people on the committee that understand that balance and those that have no clue. And I'm worried that we're going to go to at least a period, because everything goes in a pendulum back and forth. We're going to go through a period where everybody on the committee is going to be completely devoid of hands-on experience of being involved in drug development, because they're going to be tainted somehow by the evil pharma.
Right. Right. Well, Barry, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to share your top priorities for Connect Biopharma, kind of in the short to medium term. What's on deck for you? What are you most looking forward to and aiming for with the company right now?
Yeah, so our sole focus is the completion of these two trials that we discussed previously, looking at the drug and the treatment of an acute exacerbation. We believe that we can provide really a dramatic benefit to patients that are having a significant issue breathing, get them to the point where they are stable much faster and hopefully not come back. And so that's our sole goal at this point. Get that message out. We're fortunate that we have the financial wherewithal to be able to conduct those studies, still have a runway into 2027. So we're not out, hat in hand, and in a difficult period for financing a biotech.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry about that. It's all execution at this point. And, we're just excited to get those studies going, and hopefully we'll have the data first half of next year, and that will assist us in being able to, devise a very clear phase 3 program. But the great part about this acute opportunity is usual asthma or COPD studies take years to conduct, and it's a year follow up. This is a 1 month endpoint, and so as long as we can recruit the right patients, it's a short study, get the data early next year, and rock and roll.
Excellent. Barry, thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That is Barry Quart, CEO of Connect Biopharma. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out our new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at lifescienceleader.com. We'll see you next week, and thank you for listening.